we are examining 10 murderers who meticulously documented their own atrocities. Those strict platform guidelines prevent us from broadcasting the raw footage, forcing us to rely entirely on the chilling, undeniable facts. Our descent into this abyss begins with a narcissist whose desperate need for a digital legacy escalated into a highly publicized, on-camera execution. Lin Jun was a 33-year-old international student from Wuhan, China, who had moved to Montreal, Canada, seeking a high-quality education and a peaceful life in a city known for its vibrant multicultural environment. He was enrolled as an undergraduate at Concordia University, studying engineering and computer science, while quietly working as a part-time convenience store clerk to support his modest lifestyle. Friends and family described him as a gentle, optimistic, and hard-working individual who maintained a relatively low profile, focusing entirely on his academic aspirations and personal independence. In stark contrast to Lin Jun's quiet ambition was the frantic, deeply disturbed existence of a man named Luca Rocco Magnotta, a failed actor and sex worker who was utterly consumed by a pathological desire for global infamy. For years, Magnotta had meticulously cultivated a bizarre digital footprint, creating thousands of fake social media profiles and websites dedicated to spreading fabricated rumors about his own life, attempting to force himself into the public consciousness through sheer volume of disinformation. His narcissism was deeply rooted in a profound detachment from reality, leading him to commit increasingly cruel acts for an online audience, beginning with the anonymous, recorded torture and killing of kittens that drew the ire of amateur internet sleuths worldwide. Despite the growing online outrage surrounding these initial videos, law enforcement agencies were initially slow to connect the digital breadcrumbs to a tangible, physical threat, allowing Magnotta to operate within a dangerous gray area of internet anonymity. This unchecked escalation from animal cruelty to an insatiable craving for ultimate notoriety created a deadly collision course between a man desperate to be remembered and an innocent student, simply trying to build a stable future. Magnotta's desire to graduate from animal abuse to human murder was not a sudden, heat-of-the-moment impulse, but rather a cold, calculated progression designed to shock the world and secure his name in the annals of criminal history. The tragic intersection of these two entirely different lives would ultimately result in one of the most highly publicized, heavily documented, and fiercely investigated crimes of the 21st century. The fragile normalcy of Lin Jun's life was abruptly shattered in late May of 2012 when he mysteriously vanished, prompting his frantic friends to report his disappearance to the Montreal police after he failed to show up for a scheduled shift at work. Concurrently, a deeply disturbing piece of media titled "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick" surfaced on a Notorious Gore website, immediately generating a massive wave of horror and revulsion across the darker corners of the internet. The footage, which ran for approximately 10 minutes, depicted the gruesome murder, dismemberment, and desecration of an Asian male, captured with chilling clarity by a perpetrator who had deliberately set up a camera to document his atrocity. The video was methodically edited, featuring a soundtrack that highlighted the killer's sickening sense of theatricality, and it provided irrefutable visual evidence of the crime as it unfolded in a dimly lit, poster-covered apartment. Viewers who had previously tracked the anonymous kitten killing videos quickly recognized the perpetrator's distinct physical features, the identical movie posters in the background, and the chillingly familiar modus operandi, immediately alerting authorities to the horrifying escalation. Investigators were suddenly faced with an unprecedented scenario, where the crime was not a hidden secret waiting to be carefully uncovered, but a global broadcast designed specifically to taunt law enforcement and traumatize the general public. The horrifying realization that the victim in the video was the missing Concordia University student transformed a localized missing persons case into a frantic, high-stakes homicide investigation almost overnight. This calculated broadcast marked the absolute point of no return, bridging the gap between digital depravity and physical murder, and cementing Magnotta's intention to use the internet as a weapon of mass psychological disturbance. The authorities now had to navigate a complex labyrinth of digital evidence. Recognizing that the killer was actively monitoring the public reaction to his gruesome handiwork from behind a computer screen, the upload of this footage proved that the perpetrator viewed his victim not as a human being, but merely as a prop for his macabre production, permanently altering the landscape of modern digital forensics. As detectives scrambled to authenticate the horrific footage and locate the exact crime scene, the investigation took a severely grotesque turn when packages containing severed human remains began arriving at the headquarters of major Canadian political parties in Ottawa. These grisly deliveries, which included a severed foot and hand sent via the National Postal Service, were accompanied by taunting, handwritten notes, instantly escalating the situation into an unprecedented national security crisis. Montreal police subsequently traced the origin of the video to a specific apartment complex in the working Class CD Des Neiges neighborhood, where they discovered a blood-soaked mattress, extensive biological evidence, and the torso of Lin Jun discarded in a suitcase behind the building. By the time heavily armed law enforcement breached the apartment, Magnotta had already fled the country, utilizing the significant head start he had carefully engineered by pre-booking international flights to Europe before the authorities could definitively link him to the victim. This realization triggered a massive, multi-jurisdictional manhunt, resulting in Interpol issuing an urgent red notice, marking Magnotta as one of the most highly sought and dangerous fugitives on the planet. For several agonizing days, international authorities chased a ghost, tracking his movements through airport security cameras in Paris and utilizing mobile phone pings that indicated a highly mobile, yet entirely erratic, flight from justice. The relentless media frenzy surrounding the case provided Magnotta with the exact type of global attention he had pathologically craved, creating a perverse feedback loop where the global news cycle actively fed his narcissistic desires. Detectives were forced to sift through massive amounts of digital forensics, analyzing his internet search history, fake aliases, and European travel records, while simultaneously dealing with subsequent packages of remains intercepted en route to elementary schools in Vancouver. The relentless pressure of the international manhunt highlighted the logistical nightmare of tracking a suspect who actively manipulated media coverage to his advantage, keeping authorities one step behind as he slipped seamlessly across European borders. Law enforcement agencies across multiple countries were pushed to their absolute limits, forced to coordinate intelligence and resources in real time to intercept a killer who seemed to thrive on the chaotic energy of the chase. The climax of this sprawling, high-stakes international pursuit arrived in a remarkably anti-climactic yet psychologically revealing setting on June 4, 2012, inside a small, unassuming internet cafe in the Neukölln district of Berlin, Germany. The observant owner of the cafe, a perceptive man named Kadir Anli, recognized Magnotta from the globally distributed Interpol notices and quietly flagged down a passing police patrol, while the fugitive was deeply engrossed in a computer terminal. When heavily armed German police officers stormed the establishment and confronted him, Magnotta did not offer any physical resistance, simply stating his identity with a chilling, detached lack of emotion that unsettled the arresting officers. The absolute apex of the investigation was not a dramatic, cinematic shootout, but the deeply pathetic realization of what Magnotta was doing at the exact moment of his capture. He was actively reading news articles and viewing images of himself, obsessively consuming the coverage of his own crimes. This specific moment of apprehension perfectly encapsulated the killer's core motivation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the brutal murder of Lin Jun was entirely orchestrated to secure this exact type of narcissistic global spotlight. The authorities immediately secured the terminal and analyzed his final digital footprint, which served as the ultimate confirmation of his vanity, completely dismantling any potential future defense of accidental death or temporary, uncontrollable insanity. His swift surrender demonstrated that the thrill of the chase was merely a secondary objective, compared to his primary goal of securing his place in the digital history books as a mastermind criminal. The apprehension brought a profound sense of relief to the international community, abruptly terminating the deadly, self-directed movie he had been forcing the entire world to watch for weeks. The Berlin arrest effectively neutralized the immediate physical threat to the public, abruptly shifting the focus of the massive operation from a desperate manhunt to the intricate, methodical process of securing his extradition. Magnotta was finally placed in handcuffs, firmly ending his reign of digital terror and ensuring that he would be brought back to Canadian soil to face the monumental consequences of his documented atrocities. Following his highly publicized extradition to Montreal under heavy guard, Luca Magnotta faced a grueling trial where his defense team attempted to argue that he was not criminally responsible due to severe mental illness, specifically citing a diagnosis of schizophrenia. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that the murder was highly premeditated and methodically executed, pointing to the meticulously planned recording, the purchasing of filming equipment, and the calculated mailing of remains as irrefutable proof of his cognitive awareness. In December 2014, a jury found Magnotta guilty of first-degree murder, along with other serious charges including committing an indignity to a human body, publishing obscene material, and criminally harassing political figures. The guilty verdict resulted in a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years, ensuring that his desperate bid for fame would ultimately lead to decades of strict isolation. The brutal reality of the trial provided absolutely no comfort to the grieving family of Lin Jun, who traveled all the way from China to witness the proceedings, forced to endure the agonizing details of how their son's life was extinguished for a digital spectacle. Today, Magnotta remains securely incarcerated in a maximum security Canadian penitentiary, permanently stripped of the internet access and public attention he so violently sought, relegated to the strict obscurity he fundamentally despised. The chilling reality of a killer who genuinely believed he could orchestrate the perfect crime while simultaneously broadcasting it through a camera lens is a terrifying modern phenomenon, serving as a dark warning about the dangers of unchecked narcissism. However, this disturbing psychological profile, driven by a perverse desire to document the horrific suffering of others, is not entirely unique to this particular case or to the digital age. While Magnotta used the lens to aggressively broadcast his atrocities to the world, another modern predator used his camera to meticulously stalk his prey from the shadows, entirely unaware that the very footage he captured would become the undisputed catalyst for his own undoing. We now turn our attention from a desperate narcissist to a highly methodical law student, a man who documented his own terrifying obsession and mistakenly believed his academic intelligence could outsmart the chilling digital evidence he left behind on his own devices. Lauren Giddings was a vibrant, 27-year-old recent graduate of Mercer University's Walter F. George School of Law, living in a modest apartment complex in the quiet, historic city of Macon, Georgia, where she was diligently preparing for the upcoming state bar exam. Originally from Maryland, she was widely known among her peers and professors for her radiant personality, her unwavering dedication to public service, and her innate ability to make everyone around her feel valued and heard. She resided in a ground-floor unit of the Barristers Hall Apartments, a building heavily populated by fellow law students who formed a tight-knit community bound by the shared stress of grueling legal studies. Living directly next door to Lauren was a 25-year-old classmate named Stephen McDaniel, an awkward, highly intelligent, and notoriously eccentric individual who stood in stark contrast to her outgoing nature. While Lauren was a natural socialite and a prominent figure on campus, McDaniel was socially isolated, known for his unkempt appearance, his intense fascination with medieval weaponry, and a disconcerting tendency to make inappropriate, morbid comments in academic settings. Despite his oddities, most classmates simply dismissed him as a harmless, socially inept outlier, utterly unaware of the deep, pathological obsession he was secretly cultivating toward his bright and popular neighbor. For months, McDaniel masked his dark fixations behind the mundane facade of a stressed law student, blending into the background while meticulously observing Lauren's daily routines, her comings and goings, and her interactions with others. Lauren, entirely focused on launching her promising legal career and completely oblivious to the danger lurking just feet away from her front door, maintained a polite but distant neighborly relationship with him. The striking juxtaposition between Lauren's bright future and McDaniel's festering, hidden malice created a silent, localized tension that no one in their academic circle could have possibly recognized. This deceptive normalcy would soon be violently shattered, revealing that the greatest threat to the aspiring attorney was not a random stranger, but a fellow student who had weaponized his proximity to execute a terrifyingly methodical plan. In late June of 2011, the quiet academic focus at Barristers Hall was abruptly disrupted when Lauren's friends and family realized they had not heard from her in several days, an extremely uncharacteristic silence that immediately triggered intense alarm. After she failed to return phone calls and missed important study sessions, concerned classmates contacted the local police to request a welfare check, leading to the chilling discovery that her apartment was empty, yet her keys, phone, and wallet were still inside. As the Macon police launched a frantic search and missing persons investigation, local news crews quickly descended upon the apartment complex to interview residents and gather information about the sudden, alarming disappearance of the popular law graduate. Stephen McDaniel, positioning himself as a concerned neighbor and helpful classmate, willingly stepped in front of a local television station's camera to grant an interview, expressing his hope that she was safe and presenting a facade of nervous anxiety. However, as the live broadcast unfolded, the reporter off-handedly informed McDaniel that investigators had just discovered an unidentified human torso wrapped in plastic inside a trash receptacle right on the apartment grounds. The exact moment this information was relayed to McDaniel was broadcast live to the public, capturing a visceral, full-body physiological collapse as the reality of his own catastrophic miscalculation suddenly washed over him. His eyes widened in absolute terror, his breathing became shallow and erratic, and he physically slumped away from the camera, muttering that he needed to sit down as he realized police had found the body parts he believed he had perfectly disposed of. This televised breakdown was the undisputed point of no return for the investigation, instantly transforming McDaniel from a seemingly helpful bystander into the primary person of interest in a horrific homicide case. The raw, unfiltered footage of his reaction provided investigators with a massive psychological red flag, shifting the entire trajectory of the search from a rescue mission to a localized murder investigation focused directly on the man next door. McDaniel's desperate attempt to control the narrative by speaking to the media had spectacularly backfired, inadvertently broadcasting his guilt to the world and giving detectives the exact opening they needed to tear down his alibi. Following his bizarre television appearance and the subsequent identification of the remains as belonging to Lauren Giddings, detectives immediately brought Stephen McDaniel into the police station for what would become one of the most chilling and highly scrutinized interrogations in modern criminal history. Placed in a stark, windowless interview room, McDaniel adopted a terrifyingly rigid posture, sitting completely motionless for hours at a time, staring blankly at the walls, and responding to direct accusations with an unnerving, vacant silence. His deliberate physical rigidity and refusal to engage normally with seasoned detectives were calculated tactics drawn from his own legal education. Attempting to frustrate investigators and avoid making self-incriminating statements without formally invoking his right to counsel. While McDaniel stubbornly maintained his eerie silence in the interrogation room, law enforcement executed a comprehensive search warrant on his adjacent apartment, uncovering a massive cache of deeply disturbing physical and digital evidence. Investigators found packaging for a master key that allowed him unauthorized access to other units in the building, including Lauren's, completely shattering the illusion that her locked door provided any real security. Furthermore, police discovered a hacksaw with forensic evidence linking it to the dismemberment, meticulously matching the tool marks on the recovered remains despite McDaniel's calculated attempts to clean and hide the weapon. The search of his computer hard drives revealed a horrifying digital trail of premeditation, including extensive internet searches about how to commit the perfect murder. how to dissolve human tissue, and how to manipulate police interrogations. Detectives methodically pieced together a timeline that showed McDaniel had spent months researching and planning the crime, completely contradicting any potential defense that this was an impulsive or accidental tragedy. As the mountain of forensic evidence grew, the initial image of a socially awkward student dissolved entirely, replaced by the profile of a highly organized, predatory killer who believed his intellect made him untouchable. The investigation systematically dismantled his carefully constructed defenses, cornering him with an overwhelming accumulation of physical clues, digital logs, and his own highly suspicious behavior during the early hours of the case. The absolute peak of tension and the most damning revelation in the entire case came when forensic computer analysts managed to recover deleted files from a digital camera that McDaniel had desperately attempted to wipe clean before his arrest. Hidden deep within the corrupted data sectors were several chilling, first-person video recordings that McDaniel had secretly filmed in the days and weeks leading up to the brutal murder. The recovered footage showed McDaniel stealthily prowling outside Lauren's apartment in the dead of night, using a long stick to manipulate her window blinds, and pressing his camera against the glass to covertly film her inside her own bedroom. This undeniable visual evidence proved that he was not merely an eccentric neighbor, but a dedicated, voyeuristic predator who actively documented his own escalating stalking behavior with terrifying precision. The realization that he had intentionally filmed his own predatory reconnaissance completely destroyed any remaining legal maneuvers his defense team could possibly deploy, providing a chilling first-hand perspective of his obsessive madness. When confronted with the undeniable reality that his own camera had captured his guilt and permanently recorded his sick fixations, the immovable facade that McDaniel had maintained for nearly a year finally collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Realizing he was facing the very real possibility of a death sentence in the state of Georgia, the former law student calculated his final legal move, abandoning his silence to negotiate a plea deal. In a shocking courtroom climax, McDaniel explicitly confessed to using the master key to enter Lauren's apartment while she slept, strangling her to death, and subsequently dismembering her body in a bathtub to conceal the crime. This horrific admission, delivered with the same cold, detached demeanor he had displayed during his interrogations, cemented his guilt and provided a horrifyingly clear picture of his calculated depravity. His own compulsion to document his stalking had provided the indisputable key to unlocking the entire mystery, proving that his vanity and obsession directly engineered his own spectacular downfall. Stephen McDaniel formally pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Lauren Giddings, a calculated legal maneuver that allowed him to avoid the death penalty, but secured his permanent removal from society. The presiding judge sentenced him to life in prison, ensuring that the former aspiring attorney would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, a stark and permanent end to the legal career he had once studied so meticulously to build. In the aftermath of his conviction, Mercer University took the unprecedented step of formally revoking McDaniel's law degree, completely erasing his academic legacy and symbolically separating the institution from his horrific crimes. The tragic loss of Lauren Giddings left a profound and lasting void in the lives of her family, friends, and the broader legal community, who continue to mourn a brilliant young woman whose promising future was violently stolen. The case remains a chilling testament to the unseen dangers that can lurk behind ordinary facades, and a stark reminder of how digital forensics can permanently ensnare those who believe they can outsmart the justice system. McDaniel's fatal flaw was his pathological need to capture his obsession on camera, a modern technological twist that ultimately served as the most critical, irrefutable witness against him in the court of law. While McDaniel used his camera as a covert tool to stalk his victim from the shadows before striking, other predators in history have utilized the lens in a much more direct, interactive, and terrifying manner. There are those who do not hide in the dark with a camera, but rather use the guise of legitimate photography to lure their victims into carefully constructed traps under the bright glare of studio lights. This devastating misuse of trust shifts our focus entirely away from modern digital surveillance, transporting us back to a time when physical film was the ultimate medium for capturing absolute dread. We now shift our focus to a notoriously cunning predator from the mid-20th century, a man who exploited the glamorous ambitions of young women, using the promise of a professional photo shoot to capture their genuine, final moments of absolute terror on film. During the late 1950s, the bustling city of Los Angeles stood as a glittering beacon for thousands of young women across the country, all migrating to the West Coast with profound hopes of securing lucrative careers in the flourishing modeling and entertainment industries. Among these hopeful arrivals was a 19-year-old named Judy Dole, a young mother separated from her husband, who actively sought steady work through local modeling agencies to support herself and her child. In a city teeming with aspiring talent and opportunistic professionals, a seemingly innocuous television repairman named Harvey Glatman seamlessly blended into the background of urban life, harboring a dark, sadistic fixation that he cleverly masked behind a carefully constructed professional guise. Glatman recognized that the intense ambition of these young women made them inherently vulnerable to promises of employment, prompting him to adopt the false persona of a legitimate commercial photographer seeking talent for specific, high-paying assignments. He systematically contacted various modeling agencies and individual girls, offering them unusually high wages to pose for covers of popular true detective and pulp fiction magazines, a highly specific genre that frequently featured dramatic illustrations of women in perilous situations. This brilliant, albeit utterly predatory, pretext provided Glatman with a seemingly legitimate, professional excuse to require his models to be tightly bound and gagged during the duration of the photo shoot. By presenting this bizarre requirement up front as a strict professional necessity for the magazine artwork, he successfully bypassed the natural skepticism and survival instincts of his victims, convincing them to willingly submit to physical restraints under the bright glare of studio lights. The models, believing they were merely participating in a harmless, highly paid acting gig that would advance their careers, would willingly follow him to his secluded apartment studio, entirely unaware that the man behind the camera was a deeply disturbed predator. This deceptive methodology allowed Glatman to orchestrate the perfect trap, transforming the very ambition that brought these women to Hollywood into the instrument of their own horrific demise. The tragic reality was that the bright lights of Glatman's camera flashes were not illuminating a path to stardom, but rather illuminating the final, terrifying moments of their lives before the professional illusion violently collapsed. The devastating shift from a professional modeling assignment to a stark, inescapable reality occurred the exact moment Glatman firmly secured the heavy ropes around the wrists and ankles of Judy Dole inside his apartment. Once the young woman was entirely immobilized and physically helpless, relying entirely on the trust established by his photographer persona, the unassuming demeanor of the television repairman instantly vanished, replaced by the chilling, undeniable reality of a sadistic captor. Glatman deliberately walked out of the camera's immediate view and returned holding a loaded pistol, utilizing the weapon not just to enforce absolute compliance, but to induce a genuine, paralyzing state of absolute terror in his restrained victim. The camera, which had just moments before represented a promising career opportunity and a paycheck, was abruptly weaponized, becoming a tool for Glatman to permanently document the visceral, unsimulated panic radiating from the bound woman. He methodically adjusted the lighting, checked the angles, and snapped multiple photographs capturing the exact, harrowing realization dawning in Judy's eyes as she comprehended that the pulp fiction scenario was actually a deadly reality. This horrifying sequence of events marked the definitive point of no return, bridging the gap between a deceptive lure and an active hostage situation. As the facade of the professional photo shoot was permanently discarded and replaced by sheer malice, Glatman derived profound psychological gratification, not merely from the physical control he exerted over his victims, but from his ability to permanently capture their purest essence of fear on black and white film, preserving their trauma for his own future viewing. The flashbulbs popping in the confined space of the apartment signaled the absolute end of the deception, leaving the victim trapped in a nightmare where her screams were silenced by a real gag and her struggles were rendered futile by genuine bindings. The chilling photographs, taken during these initial moments of revelation, were not intended for any magazine publisher, but were meticulously composed trophies designed solely to satisfy the twisted desires of a man who equated human terror with artistic achievement. By the time the camera shutter clicked to capture that first image of authentic dread, the victim's fate was sealed, completely isolated from the outside world and entirely at the mercy of a predator who held both the weapon and the lens. Following the brutal murder of Judy Dole in the remote deserts outside Los Angeles, Glatman grew increasingly confident in his flawless methodology, subsequently employing the exact same deceptive trap to ensnare two more victims, Shirley Ann Bridgeford and Ruth Mercado. The investigation into the sudden disappearances of these young women initially presented a monumental challenge for local law enforcement, as the transient nature of aspiring actresses in Hollywood often meant that sudden departures or lack of communication were not immediately treated as highly suspicious. Detectives eventually began recovering the discarded, decomposing remains of the victims in desolate, isolated regions of the Southern California desert, a grim confirmation that a highly organized and mobile serial killer was actively operating within the sprawling metropolis. However, investigators struggled immensely to find a definitive physical link connecting the victims or leading them to a viable suspect, as Glatman was incredibly meticulous about removing all identifying materials and avoiding leaving traditional forensic evidence at the remote dump sites. Meanwhile, Glatman comfortably resumed his quiet, unremarkable life as a television repairman by day, retreating to his apartment by night to carefully develop the horrific negatives in his own personal darkroom, completely insulated from the frantic police dragnet expanding across the county. He compiled these chilling images into private photo albums, creating a horrifying chronological record of his atrocities that allowed him to endlessly relive the absolute power he held over the women during their final hours in captivity. The mounting suspense surrounding the unsolved desert murders gripped the Los Angeles area, creating a pervasive atmosphere of fear among young women in the entertainment industry as rumors of a predator targeting models began to circulate widely through the agencies. Law enforcement pursued numerous dead end leads, interviewing countless individuals within the local modeling circuits and tracking down false suspects, completely unaware that the perpetrator was a mundane tradesman hiding behind the sophisticated guise of commercial photography. Glatman's ability to repeatedly execute his complex trap without drawing any suspicion toward his actual identity demonstrated a terrifying level of cunning, allowing him to operate with total impunity as the local death toll slowly climbed. The investigation seemed hopelessly stalled in a labyrinth of missing persons reports and scattered desert crime scenes, waiting for a critical error from a killer who firmly believed his photographic ruse was entirely foolproof and his identity permanently concealed. The catastrophic unraveling of Glatman's meticulously planned killing spree occurred in October of 1958, when he successfully lured a strong-willed, 28-year-old woman named Lorraine Vigil using the familiar promise of a lucrative photography assignment. However, instead of taking her directly to his heavily controlled apartment studio, Glatman made a crucial deviation from his established routine, driving her out toward a secluded stretch of the Santa Ana freeway under the pretext of scouting a remote location for an outdoor shoot. As the car pulled over onto the desolate shoulder of the highway, Glatman suddenly produced his pistol, ordering Vigil to submit to being bound, expecting the exact same paralyzing fear and total compliance that had doomed his previous victims. Instead of freezing in terror, Lorraine Vigil instantly recognized the lethal reality of the situation and fought back with astonishing ferocity, launching a desperate, violent struggle for her life within the confined space of the vehicle. She aggressively grabbed the barrel of the loaded weapon, wrestling with the stunned predator as they thrashed against the seats and doors, her sheer will to survive completely disrupting his carefully orchestrated script. During the chaotic physical altercation, the firearm accidentally discharged, sending a bullet tearing directly through Glatman's thigh, causing him immense pain and momentarily neutralizing his physical advantage over the frantic woman fighting for her survival. Miraculously, a passing California Highway Patrol officer happened to notice the violent commotion inside the parked vehicle and immediately pulled over to investigate, intervening at the exact moment the struggle reached its absolute physical peak. The officer swiftly disarmed the bleeding, incapacitated Glatman and secured the scene, fundamentally transforming a near-fatal abduction into the immediate, unceremonious capture of one of California's most elusive and dangerous serial killers. This dramatic roadside confrontation served as the ultimate climax of the terror spree, abruptly ending Glatman's reign of violence, not through meticulous detective work, but through the incredible bravery of a woman who adamantly refused to become another photograph in his grim collection. The facade of the professional photographer shattered instantly on the side of that highway, leaving a wounded, defeated predator firmly in the custody of law enforcement, completely exposed to the justice system he had cleverly evaded for months. Following his dramatic roadside arrest, detectives quickly secured a search warrant for Glatman's apartment, where they uncovered the horrific, irrefutable evidence of his crimes perfectly preserved within his meticulously maintained personal darkroom. Investigators discovered the hidden photo albums containing the incredibly clear, deeply disturbing final images of Judy, Shirley, and Ruth, visually documenting their agonizing captivity and eliminating any possible opportunity for Glatman to deny his direct involvement. Confronted with the overwhelming reality of his own photographic trophies, Glatman abandoned all attempts at deception and readily confessed to the murders with a chilling, clinical detachment, explicitly confirming that the visual documentation of their genuine fear was his primary psychological motivation. The stark, black and white photographs served as the absolute cornerstone of the prosecution's case, providing the jury with undeniable, visual proof of his immense sadism, rendering a lengthy or complex trial almost entirely unnecessary. In a remarkably swift legal proceeding, Harvey Glatman was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, ultimately dying in the lethal gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison in September of 1959, less than a year after his initial capture. The rapid execution permanently closed the book on the Lonely Hearts Killer, ensuring that the man who built a lethal career on elaborate deception and visual exploitation faced the ultimate consequence for his undeniable atrocities. The chilling legacy of his crimes remains a grim historical reminder of how trust can be heavily weaponized and how the pursuit of professional ambition can be tragically exploited by predators hiding behind a camera lens. Glatman's pathological need to capture still images of his victims ultimately provided the very physical evidence that sent him to the execution chamber, establishing a terrifying precedent for killers who meticulously document their own evil. As we move forward through the timeline of recorded true crime, the technology evolves from solitary, black and white photographs developed in a quiet darkroom, to moving video captured by a pair of predators who shared their sadistic desires. We must now turn our attention from a lone wolf operating in the 1950s to a seemingly perfect, modern married couple in Canada, whose horrific cache of hidden home videos ultimately dismantled their elaborate web of lies and exposed a shared, unparalleled depravity. In the early 1990s, the quiet, picturesque suburban community of St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada, became the unsuspecting backdrop for one of the most horrifying and deceptive criminal partnerships in modern history. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka presented an incredibly polished, picture-perfect facade to the outside world, earning them the moniker of the Ken and Barbie couple due to their striking physical attractiveness and upwardly mobile lifestyle. Bernardo was a handsome, charismatic university graduate working as an accountant, while Homolka was a bright, beautiful young woman employed as an assistant at a local veterinary clinic, surrounded by animals she claimed to love. Their lavish, fairy tale wedding in 1991 further solidified their image as a flawless, deeply in love pair who were destined for a prosperous and happy future in their immaculate pink house on Bayview Drive. However, hidden entirely behind this pristine exterior of middle-class perfection lay a dark, shared psychopathy that bonded the couple together through a mutual obsession with extreme sexual violence and absolute dominance. In reality, Bernardo was a prolific serial predator who had already terrorized the neighboring city of Toronto as the elusive Scarborough rapist, a violent streak that only escalated once he found a willing accomplice in his new bride. Together, they transformed their comfortable suburban home into a fortified, soundproof torture chamber where they systematically abducted, assaulted, and murdered innocent teenage girls, viewing human lives merely as disposable tools for their own sadistic gratification. Their victims included vibrant local teenagers like 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey and 15-year-old Kristen French, who were snatched off the streets in broad daylight and brought back to the Bayview Drive residence to endure unimaginable horrors. The absolute depths of their shared depravity were perhaps most chillingly demonstrated when they conspired to drug and assault Carla's own younger sister, Tammy, leading to her accidental death under the guise of a tragic holiday drinking accident. This terrifying duality, maintaining a flawless public image while actively operating as ruthless apex predators behind locked doors, allowed them to evade police suspicion for years as the local community desperately searched for the missing girls. The stark contrast between their manicured lawn and the hidden horrors occurring in their basement highlights the chilling reality that pure evil can easily mask itself behind the most ordinary, attractive, and seemingly harmless facades. The impenetrable fortress of deception that Bernardo and Homolka had meticulously constructed ultimately began to fracture, not from external law enforcement pressure, but from a severe internal escalation of domestic violence. By late 1992, Bernardo's uncontrollable aggression and need for absolute dominance had increasingly turned inward, resulting in frequent, severe beatings directed at the very woman who had willingly helped facilitate his darkest crimes. This volatile situation reached its breaking point over the New Year holiday in early 1993, when Bernardo brutally assaulted Homolka with a heavy flashlight, leaving her face severely battered and forcing her to seek medical attention at a local hospital. This sudden, highly visible rupture in their unified front provided the exact opening that the authorities desperately needed, as regional task forces had already been slowly closing in on Bernardo as a prime suspect in both the Scarborough rapes and the recent teenage abductions. Realizing that the walls were rapidly closing in, and fearing for her own physical safety, Homolka made a highly calculated decision to flee the marital home, immediately seeking refuge with her family and abruptly severing her ties with her violent husband. Guided by her relatives and heavily advised by legal counsel, she approached law enforcement with an explosive offer, promising to solve the region's most terrifying mysteries in exchange for absolute protection from the man she claimed was an uncontrollable monster. In a series of gripping police interviews, Homolka meticulously crafted a narrative that placed the entirety of the blame squarely on Bernardo's shoulders, feeding investigators horrific, deeply guarded details about the abductions and murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. She painted a highly convincing portrait of herself as a deeply traumatized, brutally battered wife who was repeatedly forced to participate in the atrocities under the constant, immediate threat of severe physical harm or death. This brilliant, manipulative performance successfully convinced the desperate authorities that she was merely a secondary victim rather than an equal predator, setting the stage for one of the most controversial legal agreements in Canadian history. Driven by an intense public pressure to secure a conviction against the primary suspected killer, the prosecution formally agreed to a highly controversial plea deal, granting Homolka a remarkably lenient 12-year sentence for manslaughter in exchange for her star testimony against her husband. This pivotal legal agreement marked the absolute point of no return for the investigation, legally binding the state to a specific narrative of events before they had fully uncovered the devastating physical evidence hidden within the walls of the Bayview Drive home. Armed with Homolka's harrowing testimony and a formally signed plea agreement, law enforcement agencies launched a massive, highly publicized, and painstakingly thorough forensic excavation of the couple's St. Catharines residence. Detectives and crime scene technicians systematically dismantled the pink house from the inside out, stripping away layers of drywall, tearing up carpeting, and chemically processing every conceivable surface in a desperate search for corroborating physical evidence. The exhaustive search slowly began to yield crucial, yet fragmentary, biological trace evidence that confirmed the sheer brutality of the crimes described by the surviving spouse, validating the horrific reality that the missing girls had indeed perished within those walls. However, despite the undeniable presence of forensic markers, the prosecution's case against Bernardo still relied dangerously heavily on the sworn testimony of a confessed accomplice, a notoriously precarious legal foundation that a skilled defense attorney could potentially exploit. As the horrifying, explicit details of the schoolgirl abductions and the subsequent domestic violence were leaked to the voracious press, the entire Canadian nation was gripped by a suffocating atmosphere of dread, sorrow, and intense public outrage. The intense media scrutiny quickly shifted toward the perceived extreme leniency of Homolka's heavily guarded plea agreement, as the public struggled to reconcile her admitted involvement in the torture of teenagers with a mere 12-year prison sentence. Unbeknownst to the frantic investigators who were literally tearing the Bayview Drive home apart down to its wooden studs, the absolute, objective truth of the atrocities was perfectly preserved on physical media, deliberately concealed within the very architecture they were actively examining. Throughout their killing spree, Bernardo had meticulously recorded dozens of hours of their sadistic crimes on standard VHS tapes, documenting their shared depravity with terrifying, undeniable clarity using a common home video camera mounted on a tripod. Just prior to his inevitable arrest as the police net tightened, Bernardo had cleverly hidden these highly incriminating cassettes deep within the dusty recess of a dropped-ceiling light fixture in a main-floor bathroom, effectively bypassing the initial, sweeping police searches. These hidden tapes represented a ticking time bomb of irrefutable evidence, sitting silently in the dark, while the entire justice system built a massive, highly publicized legal framework based entirely on the manipulated words of a cunning accomplice. The tension steadily mounted as Bernardo languished in jail awaiting trial, while the true narrative of the crimes remained secretly entombed within the ceiling, waiting to completely detonate the prosecution's fragile alliance with Homolka. The most shocking and devastating revelation in this sprawling, horrific saga did not occur during the frantic initial police raids, but rather months later, completely altering the established trajectory of the entire criminal prosecution. These crucial, heavily guarded VHS recordings had actually been secretly retrieved from the ceiling by Bernardo's own defense attorney, shortly after his client's arrest, guided by explicit instructions from the killer himself, who desperately wanted to preserve his grim trophies. The defense attorney kept these horrifying cassettes hidden in a locked safe for over a year, trapped in a profound ethical and legal dilemma regarding client privilege and the concealment of evidence, until overwhelming pressure finally forced their surrender to the prosecuting authorities. When seasoned homicide investigators and hardened state prosecutors finally sat down in a darkened viewing room to analyze the newly recovered footage, they were confronted with an unprecedented level of documented sadism that instantly paralyzed everyone present. The stark, undeniable video evidence immediately and permanently shattered Homolka's carefully constructed image as an unwilling, helpless victim forced into compliance by a violently abusive husband. Instead, the high-quality home videos clearly showed both husband and wife acting as equal, highly enthusiastic partners in the prolonged torture, severe degradation, and ultimate murder of the captive teenage girls. The footage captured Homolka actively orchestrating the abuse, sadistically laughing at the absolute terror of the victims, and displaying absolutely zero signs of the coercion or fear she had so convincingly described to the detectives during her plea negotiations. This devastating visual proof generated an absolute state of shock within the justice system, proving unequivocally that the state had unwittingly made a catastrophic deal with the devil, granting extreme leniency to an active apex predator. The authorities were forced to face the horrifying realization that they had been masterfully manipulated by a psychopathic killer, whose entirely fabricated narrative of victimhood was permanently dismantled by the very camera her husband had set up to immortalize their crimes. The absolute climax of the investigation was not a sudden confession or a brilliant forensic breakthrough, but the sickening illumination provided by a television screen, relentlessly exposing the sheer, unadulterated evil shared equally between the seemingly perfect suburban couple. These silent, magnetic tapes served as the ultimate, undeniable witnesses for the deceased victims, speaking truth from beyond the grave and ensuring that the absolute reality of their suffering could never be completely buried by legal maneuvering. Armed with the indisputable, harrowing video evidence recovered from the ceiling, state prosecutors easily secured the swift conviction of Paul Bernardo, presenting a case so overwhelmingly saturated with visual proof that no defense could possibly counter it. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and formally designated a dangerous offender by the court, a specific legal classification ensuring he would spend the absolute remainder of his natural life heavily isolated within a maximum security penitentiary. However, the ironclad, legally binding nature of Karla Homolka's previously finalized plea agreement meant that the Canadian justice system was strictly forced to honor her 12-year sentence, despite the newly discovered proof of her profound, active guilt. This strict adherence to the legal contract ignited an unprecedented wave of public fury, profound disgust, and nationwide protests when the true extent of her willing participation was finally exposed to a deeply betrayed public. The infamous videotapes themselves were deemed so extraordinarily vile, deeply traumatizing, and inherently dangerous that the presiding judge ordered them to be permanently sealed from public view, effectively erasing the visual record of the atrocities from the public domain. This highly unusual legal maneuver prioritized the fundamental dignity and privacy of the murdered victims and their grieving families over the morbid curiosity of the general public, ensuring the horrific footage could never be legally broadcast or openly distributed. While Homolka was eventually released back into society in 2005 after serving her full sentence, she continues to live under a dark, inescapable cloud of permanent infamy, widely regarded as one of the most hated and notorious figures in Canadian history. Meanwhile, Bernardo remains permanently locked away in solitary confinement, completely stripped of the visual trophies that he foolishly believed would immortalize his absolute control over his victims. His legacy reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale of unchecked sadism. The devastating legacy of these hidden tapes serves as a grim, permanent reminder of the absolute depravity that can be seamlessly concealed behind suburban doors, and the catastrophic, unintended consequences of killers who obsessively document their own shared madness. While the Ken and Barbie killers utilized standard VHS cameras to privately archive extensive, moving footage of their prolonged cruelty in a fortified suburban basement, other heavily organized predators relied on a much more calculated, singular use of digital media to manipulate authorities from afar. We must now completely shift our focus from a localized couple who filmed hours of hidden home movies to a solitary, highly methodical phantom who traveled thousands of miles across the country using a single, meticulously staged photograph of a deceased victim to extort ransom and unwittingly engineer his own ultimate capture. Israel Keyes was, in many ways, the absolute embodiment of a modern investigator's worst nightmare: a highly intelligent, physically imposing, an entirely transient predator who operated without any geographical boundaries or predictable patterns. He was a self-employed carpenter who led a seemingly stable, quiet life in Anchorage, Alaska, raising a daughter and maintaining a long-term relationship, presenting an outward image of a hardworking, reliable contractor. However, this mundane existence was merely a carefully constructed operational base for a man who systematically dedicated his life to the absolute perfection of random, untraceable violence across the entire North American continent. Keyes completely defied the established, traditional profiles of serial killers, deliberately rejecting any specific victimology, preferring instead to strike with absolute randomness in locations thousands of miles away from his permanent residence. He operated with military-grade precision, frequently renting cars under false names, turning off his cellular devices for days to avoid digital tracking, and paying strictly in cash to completely sever any financial trails connecting him to a specific region. His most terrifying and defining innovation was the strategic establishment of pre-planned murder kits, which he buried years in advance in remote, isolated locations across the country, anticipating his future need for weapons, zip ties, and body disposal materials. When the overwhelming, dark urge to kill eventually surfaced, Keyes would simply board a plane to a distant state, retrieve a hidden cache, select an entirely random victim of opportunity, and then quickly vanish back into the transient flow of cross-country travel. This incredibly disciplined, highly mobile methodology effectively severed all logical links between the perpetrator and the victim, rendering standard homicide investigations almost entirely useless and allowing him to operate with absolute impunity for over a decade. He was a chillingly unique apex predator, a man who viewed the entire country as his personal hunting ground and meticulously eliminated every possible variable that could ever connect his quiet life in Alaska to the trail of missing persons he left in his wake. However, in February of 2012, the rigid, highly disciplined rules that had kept Keyes entirely invisible to law enforcement abruptly crumbled when he deviated from his established methodology and committed an abduction dangerously close to his own home base. He targeted Samantha Koenig, an energetic 18-year-old barista working alone at a small, brightly lit drive-through coffee stand located in a busy commercial district in Anchorage, Alaska, under the guise of ordering a coffee in the freezing, dark winter evening. Keyes violently ambushed the young woman at gunpoint, binding her with zip ties and shoving her into his heavily modified, dark-colored pickup truck. He quickly transported his terrified captive back to his own property, specifically to a small, detached shed he used for contracting work, fundamentally violating his own cardinal rule of never bringing a victim back to a location permanently tied to his real identity. This sudden, inexplicable lapse in judgment instantly transformed a highly elusive, transient phantom into a localized predator, anchoring his horrific crime directly to his own backyard and heavily increasing his risk of exposure. He subjected Samantha to unimaginable horrors within the confined space of the shed before ultimately strangling her to death, leaving her frozen remains hidden while he coldly boarded a pre-planned family cruise departing from the Gulf of Mexico. Upon his eventual return to the snow-covered shed in Alaska, Keyes recognized a twisted opportunity to aggressively exploit the ongoing, frantic, and highly publicized local search for the missing barista, an opportunity that required him to heavily manipulate the truth using digital media. Driven by a sudden, intense desire to extort money from the grieving family and completely oblivious to the massive digital footprint he was about to create, he hatched an exceptionally morbid plan to prove to the authorities that Samantha was still alive. This catastrophic decision to pivot from a silent, untraceable killer to an active, taunting extortionist marked the absolute point of no return, forcing him to create the very physical evidence that would permanently shatter his carefully constructed invisibility. By choosing to demand ransom, Keyes willingly entered into a high-stakes, digital game of cat and mouse with federal investigators, entirely unaware that his arrogance was about to completely dismantle the perfect killing machine he had spent years building. To execute this horrifying extortion plot, Keyes engaged in a macabre and meticulously staged photographic session, specifically designed to deceive law enforcement and torment the victim's family into believing Samantha was still alive and being held captive. He retrieved her frozen body from the shed, painstakingly applied stage makeup to conceal the obvious signs of death, and used fishing line to physically prop her eyes open, creating a terrifying, grotesque illusion of life. He then secured a current issue of a local Anchorage newspaper, placing it prominently within the frame to establish a timeline, and took a chilling digital photograph using a standard camera. This single, highly manipulated image was then printed and secretly attached to a ransom note demanding 30 zloty, which he brazenly posted to a public park bulletin board in Anchorage, initiating direct contact with the desperate authorities. When detectives finally discovered the typed note and the accompanying photograph, they were immediately thrust into a desperate, high-stakes race against time, forced to analyze the horrifying image for any microscopic clues while simultaneously arranging the financial transfer. The Anchorage police, working closely with the FBI, strategically deposited the requested funds into an account linked to Samantha's stolen debit card, recognizing that this financial tether was their absolute best chance to track the elusive kidnapper. Keyes, completely confident in his ability to evade capture, immediately fled Alaska and embarked on a sprawling, erratic road trip across the American Southwest, aggressively utilizing the stolen debit card to withdraw cash at various automated teller machines. This critical, arrogant mistake instantly activated a massive, silent federal alarm system, allowing a dedicated team of cyber investigators in Washington, D.C. to begin actively tracking his exact geographical movements in real time through the banking network. Every single time Keyes inserted the stolen card into a machine in Arizona, New Mexico, or Texas, he unknowingly sent a bright, digital flare directly to the FBI, completely destroying the strict anonymity he had maintained for over a decade. The highly disciplined Phantom, who had successfully operated entirely off the grid for years, was now unwittingly painting a highly visible, undeniable digital trail straight to his current location, entirely blinded by his own greed and a false sense of superiority. The relentless, digital pursuit of Israel Keyes reached its sudden, unceremonious climax on a desolate stretch of highway in Lufkin, Texas, on March 13, 2012, completely ending his sprawling, cross-country reign of terror. Following a fresh alert from an ATM withdrawal in the area, a highly alert Texas Highway Patrol trooper spotted a white Ford Focus, perfectly matching the description of the rental vehicle type to the suspect's recent, localized movements. When the trooper initiated a routine, yet highly tense, traffic stop, Keyes, completely unaware of the massive federal dragnet closing in around him, pulled over without incident, assuming it was a standard moving violation. However, as backup units quickly swarmed the vehicle, investigators discovered a terrifying arsenal of weapons, disguises, and most importantly, Samantha Koenig's debit card and the specific mobile phone used to send the ransom demands, providing immediate, undeniable proof of his identity. The absolute peak of the investigation occurred when Keyes, sitting in an interrogation room in Texas, suddenly realized that the highly staged photograph he had created to secure the ransom had completely betrayed him, serving as the direct catalyst for his own capture. The FBI agents methodically laid out the undeniable trail of digital evidence, confronting the arrogant predator with the stark reality that his own greed and his desperate need to document his crime had completely bypassed all of his meticulous, physical safeguards. Confronted with absolute, undeniable proof of his guilt, the previously stoic killer's hardened demeanor completely fractured, leading to a series of chilling, unprecedented confessions where he casually detailed his hidden murder kits and heavily alluded to a massive, unidentified body count across the country. He recognized that his carefully constructed life in Alaska was permanently destroyed, and the terrifying realization that his own digital hubris had outsmarted his highly trained methodology finally set in, bringing an abrupt end to the perfect criminal enterprise he believed he had mastered. The discovery of the photograph and the subsequent financial tracking proved that even the most meticulously prepared, geographically fluid predator could eventually be brought down by a single, catastrophic deviation from his own strict rules. This dramatic highway arrest completely neutralized a highly active, apex predator who was fully prepared to continue his random killing spree indefinitely, bringing a sudden, highly unexpected sense of closure to a frantic, nationwide manhunt. Following his arrest and heavily guarded extradition back to Alaska, Israel Keyes engaged in a deeply disturbing psychological chess match with federal prosecutors, offering vague, tantalizing clues about other unsolved murders in exchange for specific concessions, such as his favorite cigars or a delayed trial date. Despite his extensive, chilling confessions regarding the meticulous planning of his kill kits and his transient methodology, he aggressively refused to definitively name the vast majority of his victims, maintaining a final cruel grip on the ultimate truth. In December of 2012, while awaiting a highly publicized federal trial for the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig, Keyes managed to conceal a razor blade within his heavily monitored cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex, using it to sever his own wrists before strangling himself with rolled-up bedding. His sudden suicide permanently robbed the justice system of a formal trial and abruptly denied dozens of grieving families the critical answers they desperately needed, taking the dark secrets of his exact body count completely to his grave. Today, the FBI maintains an active, dedicated webpage detailing Keyes' known travel timelines, rental car agreements, and the possible locations of his undiscovered kill kits, pleading with the public for any information that might connect this highly organized phantom to cold cases across the country. The staged photograph of Samantha Koenig remains a deeply haunting artifact, representing the exact, fatal moment when a heavily disciplined, untraceable killer finally allowed his own greed and vanity to completely override his survival instincts. The terrifying legacy of Israel Keyes serves as a stark, modern reminder that true evil does not always possess a specific zip code, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who can seamlessly blend into the transient flow of everyday life. While Keyes utilized a single, highly manipulated digital photograph to facilitate extortion and unwittingly broadcast his location, other organized killers sought to create far more extensive, permanent archives of their atrocities in deeply isolated environments. We must now shift our focus from a highly mobile phantom to a pair of survivalist predators who transformed a remote mountain cabin into an inescapable fortress. Using extensive home video equipment to document their shared, twisted philosophy and the ultimate subjugation of their captives. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng were an incredibly dangerous, deeply disturbed pairing of individuals whose shared delusions of grandeur and extreme survivalist paranoia culminated in the creation of a fortified, inescapable nightmare in the remote foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Lake was a former Marine and self-proclaimed survivalist who was entirely obsessed with the concept of a looming global nuclear holocaust, while Ng was a dishonorably discharged soldier with a penchant for petty theft and a heavily ingrained sadistic streak. Together, they retreated to a highly isolated, heavily wooded 2.5-acre property in Wilseyville, California, an environment perfectly suited to completely conceal their horrifying ambitions from the prying eyes of standard society. Outwardly, the property appeared to be nothing more than a rustic, off-the-grid retreat, but beneath the surface, Lake and Ng were meticulously constructing a reinforced cinderblock bunker, equipped with hidden surveillance equipment, heavy locks, and soundproofing materials. This subterranean structure was specifically designed not to survive a nuclear fallout, but to facilitate Operation Miranda, Lake's twisted, heavily documented philosophical project aimed at capturing and completely subjugating women for his own absolute control. The surrounding communities were entirely unaware that this fortified compound was actively functioning as a lethal trap for entirely innocent families, neighbors, and passing acquaintances who simply had the extreme misfortune of crossing paths with the heavily armed duo. Victims such as the Dubs family, who mysteriously vanished along with their infant son, and Brenda O'Connor, a neighbor looking for work, were abruptly pulled from their ordinary, peaceful lives and thrust into an unimaginable environment of total physical and psychological domination. The stark, terrifying reality of the Wilseyville cabin was that it provided a massive, completely isolated canvas for two predators to execute their shared, heavily organized fantasies without any immediate threat of localized law enforcement interference. This remote, physical isolation allowed their madness to fester and escalate entirely unchecked, completely separating their victims from the outside world and cementing their absolute authority within the heavily fortified boundaries of the property. The highly secure, seemingly impenetrable fortress of secrecy surrounding the Wilseyville compound was completely shattered in June of 1985, not by a brilliant stroke of detective work or a daring escape by a captive, but by a remarkably trivial, utterly reckless act of petty theft in South San Francisco. Charles Ng, completely disregarding the massive, lethal criminal enterprise he was actively operating, impulsively decided to shoplift a small, inexpensive metal vise from a local hardware store, immediately drawing the attention of an observant employee, who alerted a nearby police officer. When the officer approached the two men in the store's parking lot, the highly volatile NG violently threw the stolen merchandise into the trunk of their vehicle and sprinted away from the scene, completely abandoning his partner and fleeing into the urban landscape. Leonard Lake, left standing by the vehicle and entirely incapable of running, was calmly detained by the confused officer, who initially believed he was dealing with a completely standard, low-level property crime investigation. However, the routine traffic stop took an incredibly dark, highly alarming turn when the officer ran the license plates of their vehicle, discovering that the car was actually registered to a man named Paul Cosner, who had been heavily reported missing several months prior. Recognizing that the situation had drastically escalated from a simple misdemeanor to a potential homicide connection, investigators transferred Lake to the local police precinct for a formal, highly intensive interrogation regarding the missing vehicle owner. As detectives began to aggressively press him for specific answers, Lake requested a glass of water, secretly using the momentary distraction to produce a hidden cyanide capsule he had specifically sewn into the lapel of his shirt for this exact, catastrophic scenario. He swallowed the lethal poison and collapsed on the floor of the interrogation room, permanently silencing himself and completely robbing the frantic authorities of any immediate answers regarding the whereabouts of the missing individuals linked to his stolen property. This sudden, violent suicide marked the absolute point of no return for the investigation, instantly transforming a localized shoplifting incident into a sprawling, frantic search to uncover exactly what the deceased survivalist was so desperate to permanently hide. Following Lake's dramatic death in police custody, heavily armed investigators and forensic teams immediately descended upon the Wilseyville property, initiating what would quickly become one of the most massive, grueling, and horrifying logistical excavations in California history. As detectives meticulously searched the heavily wooded acreage, they uncovered the chilling, reinforced cinderblock bunker hidden deep beneath the dirt, a terrifying subterranean structure equipped with heavy metal doors that completely shattered the illusion of a simple survivalist retreat. The search teams began sifting through massive piles of disturbed earth, eventually unearthing a staggering, horrifying amount of human remains, completely fragmented and deliberately buried across the massive property to conceal the sheer volume of their atrocities. Alongside the heavily decomposed remains, investigators found massive caches of personal belongings, including the identification cards, driver's licenses, and bloody clothing of heavily reported missing families, solidifying the terrifying reality that the remote cabin was the epicenter of a massive, heavily organized killing field. Authorities quickly realized that Lake had not operated alone, and that his missing accomplice, the highly dangerous Charles Ng, was actively evading capture, triggering a massive, international manhunt to locate the fugitive before he could strike again. The sheer scale of the forensic excavation required months of painstaking labor, as crime scene technicians carefully cataloged thousands of bone fragments and heavily damaged personal effects, desperately attempting to establish a definitive body count for an enterprise that had operated completely unchecked for years. The massive media attention surrounding the Wilseyville discoveries generated a profound sense of absolute dread across the entire nation, as the public struggled to comprehend how such a massive, heavily fortified torture compound could exist completely unnoticed in the quiet foothills. The investigation was constantly hindered by the absolute destruction of physical evidence at the scene, forcing detectives to heavily rely on fragmented clues and the overwhelming, terrifying implications of the subterranean bunker to piece together the exact timeline of the disappearances. As the international manhunt for NG intensified, the sheer, undeniable magnitude of the Wilseyville horrors completely exposed the fatal vulnerability of isolated, off-the-grid living, proving that extreme privacy can easily be weaponized to conceal the most profound human atrocities. The absolute peak of psychological horror and the most devastating breakthrough in the entire Wilseyville investigation occurred when detectives discovered a series of buried, heavily protected plastic buckets containing hundreds of pages of handwritten journals and a collection of standard home video cassettes. These recovered recordings, heavily documented by Lake himself and chillingly labeled as the tapes, provided a massive, completely undeniable window into the absolute depravity that had occurred within the heavily soundproofed walls of the subterranean bunker. When hardened investigators finally played the recovered footage, they were forced to witness Lake and NG calmly, methodically explaining their deeply twisted, highly misogynistic philosophy directly to their terrified, heavily restrained female captives. The tapes captured the predators heavily demanding total, absolute physical and psychological submission, explicitly outlining their intentions to keep the women as permanent slaves, while casually confirming that their families and children had already been executed. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from victims like Brenda O'Connor, who can be seen pleading for her life and the safety of her infant child, while the heavily armed killers coldly lecture her on survivalist rules, completely shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of the crimes. This irrefutable visual documentation completely bypassed the need for speculative forensic reconstruction, providing the justice system with the exact, undeniable record of the prolonged, highly calculated psychological torture that preceded the eventual murders. The discovery of the tapes cemented the absolute reality that Lake and NG were not merely chaotic killers, but heavily organized, incredibly sadistic filmmakers who actively sought to preserve the absolute domination they achieved over their helpless captives. This horrifying cinematic legacy completely destroyed any possible legal defense NG might have eventually attempted to mount, as the camera lens permanently captured his highly active, entirely enthusiastic participation in the prolonged torture and eventual executions. The absolute climax of the entire saga was not the physical unearthing of the massive grave site, but the sickening, brightly lit illumination of the television screen, forcing the world to witness the exact, highly recorded moments when completely innocent lives were systematically dismantled for sick entertainment. The massive international manhunt for Charles NG ultimately concluded in Calgary, Canada, where his deeply ingrained, absolute compulsion for petty theft resulted in his violent arrest by store security guards following yet another completely avoidable shoplifting incident. Following a massive, heavily contested, and incredibly lengthy legal battle to secure his international extradition, NG was finally returned to California to face the overwhelming, heavily documented avalanche of physical and visual evidence stacked against him. Despite engaging in massive, highly disruptive legal maneuvers aimed at delaying his prosecution, NG was eventually convicted in 1999 on 11 counts of capital murder, heavily driven by the undeniable visual proof provided by the recovered Wilseyville video cassettes. The presiding judge subsequently sentenced him to death, relegating the surviving mastermind of Operation Miranda to the strict, heavily isolated confines of California's death row, where he remains today, permanently stripped of the absolute power he once heavily wielded in the mountains. The staggering, final death toll of the Wilseyville compound is heavily estimated to be between 11 and 25 individuals, leaving a massive, permanent void for the grieving families who were completely devastated by the deeply recorded horrors. The heavily documented nature of these crimes serves as a massive, permanent reminder of the absolute evil that can heavily fester in total isolation and the catastrophic consequences of killers who require a permanent, visual record of their absolute dominance. While Lake and NG heavily utilized the deep, physical isolation of a remote mountain bunker to privately film the total subjugation of completely captive adults, other heavily organized predators found ways to completely integrate their sadistic filmmaking into standard society. We must now heavily shift our focus across the globe to the former Soviet Union, where a highly respected youth club director utilized the complete, absolute trust of his community to camouflage his horrific snuff films as standard, highly disciplined survival experiments for young pioneers. In the heavily regimented and ideologically strict society of the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 1980s, the concept of a serial killer was officially considered a decadent Western phenomenon that simply could not exist within a perfect communist state. In the industrial city of Nevenomyssk, a man named Anatoly Slivko perfectly embodied the ultimate Soviet ideal, operating as a highly decorated, universally respected schoolteacher, a proud member of the Communist Party, and a dedicated family man. Slivko was best known as the charismatic founder and director of the Shurjid Youth Club, a highly prestigious, state-sponsored organization designed to teach young boys outdoor survival skills, mountaineering, and the rigid discipline expected of future Soviet citizens. To the parents of Nevenomyssk, having a son accepted into Slivko's elite club was considered a massive honor, guaranteeing the child would be mentored by a man recognized as an absolute pillar of the local community. Slivko cultivated an environment of extreme loyalty and absolute obedience among his young charges, utilizing his authority to become a secondary father figure to dozens of vulnerable, highly impressionable boys who desperately sought his exclusive approval. These children, many of whom came from troubled or impoverished households, viewed the Shurjid Club as a safe haven and looked up to their director with an unwavering, deeply ingrained reverence that blinded them to any potential danger. The local authorities and government officials frequently commended Slivko for his outstanding contributions to youth development, granting him unprecedented, completely unmonitored access to the children under the unquestioned guise of educational enrichment and physical training. This flawless public persona provided Slivko with the ultimate, impenetrable camouflage, allowing him to establish an absolute monopoly of trust over both the children and their parents, effectively neutralizing any natural defensive instincts they might have possessed. The tragic reality was that this pristine, highly respected youth organization was actually a meticulously constructed facade, designed entirely to provide a seemingly legitimate pipeline of vulnerable victims for a predator operating under the direct protection of state-sponsored authority. The innocent boys who eagerly packed their bags for weekend survival expeditions were completely unaware that their esteemed mentor was secretly harboring deeply sadistic, highly specific paraphilic urges that completely revolved around observing and documenting physical trauma. The devastating shift from a highly disciplined educational environment to a lethal, completely controlled hunting ground occurred when Slivko began introducing what he clinically described as specialized medical experiments and survival training into the club's curriculum. He isolated specific, highly obedient boys from the rest of the group, convincing them that they needed to participate in highly secretive, physically demanding exercises designed to test their endurance and prepare them for extreme emergencies. Slivko manipulated their intense desire to impress him by heavily integrating his own 16mm film camera into the process, falsely claiming that he was shooting an important educational documentary about survival techniques for the state and needed them to act as the brave stars of his movie. Under this brilliant, heavily coercive pretext, he convinced the trusting children to allow him to bind their hands and feet, tightly securing them to trees before placing a noose around their necks to simulate a high-stakes rescue scenario. The exact moment he tightened the rope and activated the mechanical wear of his film camera marked the absolute point of no return, transforming a respected mentor into an active, heavily armed predator capturing his own atrocities on celluloid. Slivko derived profound, pathological gratification from filming the boys as they slowly lost consciousness from the induced asphyxiation, meticulously documenting their physiological reactions, their spasms, and their total vulnerability as they hung suspended in the remote wilderness. By framing these horrific, life-threatening ordeals as completely necessary, highly classified assignments for a government film project, he successfully bypassed the victim's survival instincts, ensuring they willingly submitted to the lethal restraints without a single struggle. He would often revive the boys just before the point of death, completely reinforcing his absolute God-like control over their lives and heavily securing their continued silence by framing the traumatizing event as a highly successful, completely normal training exercise. This calculated integration of the camera, into his predatory routine, established a terrifying methodology where the act of filming became entirely inseparable from the act of violence, initiating a horrific, decades-long cycle of abuse. The lens of his camera served not merely as a passive observer, but as the central, driving motivation behind the entire charade, transforming completely innocent children into disposable actors in his own deeply disturbed, private cinematic productions. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Slivko escalated his horrifying experiments from brutal, near-fatal asphyxiation to outright, premeditated murder, completely vanishing 7 young boys from the streets of Nevinominsk between 1964 and 1985. The localized disappearances generated massive waves of panic among the families, but the rigid Soviet law enforcement apparatus fundamentally struggled to connect the missing children, heavily blinded by the state ideology that strictly denied the existence of organized serial predators within their borders. In a deeply sickening display of manipulation, Slivko actively inserted himself directly into the massive police search efforts, serving as a highly visible, deeply concerned community leader who physically led search parties and warmly comforted the devastated parents of his own victims. While he publicly performed the role of the grieving mentor, he privately retreated to his heavily locked, completely unmonitored private office within the Extorted Club to meticulously process and edit the horrific 16-minute film reels he had captured during the murders. He established an incredibly dark, highly organized archive of his atrocities, carefully splicing the footage of the dying children into neat, chronological cinematic reels that he would obsessively watch alone in the dark, constantly reliving his absolute dominance. Alongside his massive film collection, Slivko systematically preserved the neatly cleaned shoes of his victims, maintaining a hidden, physical museum of trophies that served as a tangible connection to the lives he had completely extinguished in the woods. Law enforcement repeatedly interviewed Slivko during their desperate investigations into the missing club members, but his impeccable Soviet credentials, his high standing in the Communist Party, and his helpful, cooperative demeanor consistently deflected any serious, sustained suspicion away from his activities. The investigation remained completely stalled in a massive, bureaucratic labyrinth for years, heavily frustrated by the total lack of traditional forensic evidence and the sheer, unbelievable audacity of a killer hiding directly in plain sight. His ability to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the Soviet state provided an invisible shield, ensuring that detectives continually looked outward for a phantom threat, while completely ignoring the highly decorated monster embedded deep within their own community. Slivko's ability to operate with complete impunity for over 20 years heavily demonstrated the fatal flaw of systemic denial, allowing a highly organized, completely depraved filmmaker to utilize a state-sponsored youth organization as his own personal, heavily documented slaughterhouse. The impenetrable fortress of Slivko's deeply respected public persona finally and catastrophically collapsed in late 1985, completely triggered by the sudden disappearance of a 13-year-old boy named Sergei Pavlov, whose heavily documented connection to the Extorted Club could not be easily ignored. A highly observant, newly assigned investigator named Vladimir Kolesnikov refused to be blinded by Slivko's political connections or his decorated status, noticing highly suspicious, glaring inconsistencies in the director's timeline and deeply questioning his bizarrely calm demeanor regarding the missing children. Acting on sheer instinct and a desperate need to break the decades-old deadlock, Kolesnikov aggressively secured a rare search warrant for the Extorted Youth Club, specifically targeting Slivko's heavily fortified, permanently locked private office that no other staff member was ever permitted to enter. When investigators finally breached the locked door and scoured the secluded room, they made a massive, absolutely horrifying discovery that instantly shattered the entire illusion of the benevolent teacher, uncovering a hidden compartment containing the meticulously preserved shoes of the missing victims. However, the absolute, terrifying climax of the entire investigation occurred when the detectives threaded Slivko's hidden 16-minute film reels into a projector, forcing themselves to watch the silent, undeniable visual proof of the atrocities projected brightly onto the wall. The horrifying, High-quality footage clearly depicted Slivko's own distinctly recognizable hands meticulously adjusting the deadly restraints, completely dismantling any possible defense of ignorance, and providing the justice system with the exact, irrefutable record of the systematic murders. Confronted with the absolute reality of his own deeply treasured cinematic trophies, the highly respected Soviet icon completely fractured, dropping his arrogant, helpful facade and immediately confessing to the horrific timeline of abuse, torture, and murder he had heavily documented for decades. He coldly detailed the exact locations of the unmarked graves in the remote wilderness, finally providing a grim, heavily delayed resolution to the agonizing mysteries that had plagued the city of Nevenomyssk for a generation. The discovery of these silent, highly organized films completely bypassed the need for a complex forensic reconstruction, firmly cornering the predator with the very media he had obsessively created to immortalize his absolute control. The absolute climax of the entire saga proved that his pathological need to permanently record his victims' final moments ultimately engineered his spectacular downfall, abruptly ending his 20-year reign of terror. Following his shocking, highly publicized arrest, Anatoly Slivko was formally stripped of all his esteemed state honors and brought to trial, where the heavily documented nature of his crimes completely horrified a Soviet public completely unaccustomed to such profound, systemic evil. The undeniable visual evidence captured on his own 16mm film reels left absolutely zero room for legal ambiguity, resulting in a swift, entirely unanimous guilty verdict for the murders of 7 children, though investigators heavily suspected his true victim count was significantly higher. In 1989, Slivko was formally executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in a Soviet prison, permanently removing one of the most prolific and highly deceptive predators in Russian history from society. His execution offered very little comfort to the devastated families he had profoundly betrayed, as they were forced to grapple with the devastating reality that their community's most trusted guardian was actually its most ruthless destroyer. The Turgid Youth Club, once considered a massive beacon of community pride, was permanently dissolved, completely tainted by the horrific realization that it had actively functioned as a highly organized, heavily protected hunting ground for a sadistic filmmaker. The deeply unsettling legacy of the Slivko case fundamentally forced the Soviet law enforcement apparatus to completely reevaluate their rigid, ideological approach to criminal psychology, permanently shattering the dangerous myth that serial predators could not exist within their society. His pathological, heavily organized compulsion to capture his atrocities on film ultimately provided the exact, irrefutable evidence required to secure his total downfall, proving that extreme vanity frequently overrides the fundamental survival instincts of even the most careful killers. Slivko completely utilized the deep, institutional trust of a state-sponsored youth organization to privately film his restrained victims in a stationary, highly controlled environment, creating a permanent archive of unimaginable pain. However, other highly organized predators in history adopted a much more transient, heavily mobile approach to capturing ultimate terror on camera, entirely abandoning the safety of a permanent location for the anonymity of the open road. We must now completely shift our focus from a stationary Soviet mentor to a highly mobile, heavily armed American truck driver, a man who transformed the massive interstate highway system into his own personal hunting ground and utilized a simple Polaroid camera to capture one of the most chilling, widely recognized photographs in true crime history. In the early months of 1990, Regina Walters was a vulnerable 14-year-old girl from Pasadena, Texas, who made the fateful decision to run away from home alongside her 18-year-old boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones, seeking an escape from a troubled domestic life. The 2 young teenagers embarked on a perilous journey, relying entirely on the dangerous, unpredictable method of hitchhiking across the vast American highway system with very little money and absolutely no concrete plan for their future. Their desperate bid for freedom placed them squarely in the highly transient, often invisible underbelly of interstate truck stops and roadside diners, environments teeming with strangers passing quickly through the night. Unbeknownst to the runaway couple, the sprawling network of asphalt arteries connecting the country also served as the primary hunting ground for Robert Ben Rhodes, a highly organized, deeply sadistic long-haul truck driver. Rhodes presented himself to the world as a reliable, hard-working freight hauler, an ordinary man navigating an 18-wheeler across state lines to deliver vital goods and maintain the pulse of the national economy. However, hidden immediately behind the driver's seat of his Peterbilt cab was a highly customized, heavily soundproofed sleeper compartment that he had meticulously modified into a secure, mobile torture chamber. This terrifying, rolling dungeon was equipped with heavy surgical instruments, metal handcuffs, custom-built shackles, and a reinforced locking mechanism designed to completely prevent any possibility of escape once a victim was forced inside. By completely weaponizing his legitimate profession, Rhodes possessed the ultimate geographical advantage, allowing him to endlessly cruise the highways, select highly vulnerable victims of opportunity, and entirely vanish across jurisdictional lines before local police even realized a crime had occurred. The sheer mobility of his rolling fortress fundamentally neutralized standard law enforcement profiling, making him an invisible phantom who could abduct individuals in one state, severely abuse them in another, and discard their remains in a third. The tragic intersection between the helpless, runaway Texas teenagers and the highly equipped, predatory truck driver on a desolate stretch of road in early 1990 would ultimately produce one of the most haunting, deeply unsettling pieces of visual evidence in the annals of modern true crime. The exact, devastating point of no return for the runaway teenagers occurred when they accepted a ride from Rhodes, mistakenly believing the towering 18-wheeler offered them safe, completely free passage to their next destination. Almost immediately after securing them within the confined space of his heavy truck, Rhodes brutally abandoned his friendly, helpful facade and violently asserted absolute, lethal control over his unsuspecting passengers. Recognizing that the 18-year-old Ricky Lee Jones posed a significant physical threat to his complete domination of the situation, Rhodes swiftly and mercilessly murdered the young man, immediately eliminating the only possible source of protection Regina had in the world. He ruthlessly discarded Ricky's body in a remote, highly isolated area of Mississippi, completely erasing the teenager's existence and leaving the terrified 14-year-old girl entirely isolated and at the absolute mercy of a psychopathic captor. Regina was violently forced into the heavily customized sleeper cab, permanently locked inside the rolling dungeon, as Rhodes calmly resumed his freight route, seamlessly blending back into the massive flow of interstate traffic. For several agonizing weeks, Rhodes kept the young girl captive as he drove across the country, subjecting her to an unimaginably horrific cycle of psychological torment and physical abuse, while completely hidden from the thousands of motorists passing by on the highway. During this prolonged period of forced captivity, Rhodes engaged in a deeply disturbing, highly calculated process of entirely dismantling Regina's identity, severely cutting her hair, forcing her to wear specific, degrading clothing, and treating her merely as a living prop for his sick fantasies. He maintained absolute, terrifying control over her existence, ensuring she knew that screaming was entirely futile within the soundproofed walls, and that attempting to flee the moving fortress would result in her immediate, violent death. The sheer terror of being completely trapped in a moving vehicle, with a heavily armed predator, miles away from anyone who could possibly hear her pleas, created an environment of total, suffocating despair for the young teenager. This horrific, mobile captivity set the stage for Rhodes' ultimate act of sadism, as his pathological need to permanently document his absolute power drove him to eventually seek out a highly isolated, stationary location to orchestrate his final, fatal cinematic production. In late February or early March of 1990, Rhodes deliberately navigated his massive Peterbilt truck off the busy interstate and drove deep into a highly remote, desolate agricultural area near Ricky, Illinois, searching for the perfect stage to execute his final, terrifying plan. He located a dilapidated, long-abandoned wooden barn situated far away from any main roads or neighboring farmhouses, providing him with the absolute privacy and environmental control he required to physically document his ultimate domination. Rhodes forcefully dragged the exhausted, deeply traumatized 14-year-old girl from the heavily secured sleeper cab and led her into the dark, freezing interior of the decaying structure, transforming the rural setting into a macro photography studio. He then forced Regina to change into a specific black dress and a pair of matching high heels that he had purposefully kept in his truck, a highly calculated, deeply disturbing wardrobe choice completely designed to satisfy his own twisted visual aesthetic. As the terrified girl stood near the splintered wooden walls of the barn, Rhodes meticulously readied his camera, ensuring he could perfectly capture the raw, unadulterated fear radiating from his completely helpless victim. The most infamous, highly recognized photograph in this tragic sequence shows Regina backing away, her hands raised in a desperate, deeply instinctive defensive posture, her severely chopped hair and oversized clothes highlighting the profound physical and psychological toll of her prolonged captivity. Her facial expression in the photograph captures a moment of absolute, paralyzing terror, conveying an undeniable realization that all hope is entirely lost and that the man behind the lens is about to end her life. Rhodes did not take this picture for any kind of financial gain or public notoriety. Rather, he shot the photograph entirely for his own private, sadistic archive, aiming to permanently freeze her ultimate moment of despair on a tangible piece of film that he could carry with him in the cab. The flash of the camera bulb inside that abandoned barn marked the definitive, lethal climax of her torment, capturing the very last moments of her life before Rhodes brutally strangled her to death and carelessly discarded her remains in the dirt. This singular, chilling image, which he casually kept alongside his commercial driving logs, serves as one of the most stark, horrific pieces of visual evidence ever recorded, permanently cementing the exact, agonizing reality of a predator who viewed human suffering as a collectible trophy. The catastrophic unraveling of Rhodes' highly mobile reign of terror occurred just a few weeks later on April 1, 1990, entirely by chance, when a highly observant Arizona state trooper named Mike Miller noticed a Peterbilt truck parked with its hazard lights flashing on the desolate shoulder of Interstate 10. Assuming it was a standard, routine motorist assist call, Trooper Miller pulled his cruiser behind the massive rig and approached the cab, completely unaware that he was stepping directly into an active, heavily armed hostage situation. As Miller cautiously approached the vehicle, a frantic, severely beaten, an entirely naked woman suddenly burst through the door of the cab, desperately screaming for her life and alerting the officer to the profound danger hidden inside the truck. The trooper immediately drew his service weapon, rapidly securing the incredibly tense scene and forcibly arresting the stunned driver, completely neutralizing the heavily armed predator before he could engage the lock on his mobile dungeon or escape down the highway. Upon conducting a highly intensive, physical search of the heavily customized sleeper cab, investigators were absolutely horrified to discover the intricate, soundproof torture chamber, entirely outfitted with chains, whips, surgical tools, and heavy restraints designed for prolonged captivity. The absolute apex of the investigation, however, occurred when detectives began carefully sifting through Rhodes's personal belongings within the cab, discovering a hidden cache of terrifying Polaroid photographs that completely exposed the true, massive scale of his depravity. Among these deeply disturbing visual trophies was the exceptionally clear, haunting image of Regina Walters standing defensively in the abandoned Illinois barn, a photograph that immediately launched a frantic, multi-state coordination between various law enforcement agencies. Detectives recognized that the terrified girl in the photograph had completely vanished from the face of the earth, forcing them to meticulously trace the trucker's heavily documented freight routes, gas receipts, and driving logs to pinpoint the exact location of the barn shown in the background. This undeniable, physical photographic evidence completely bypassed Rhodes's ability to deny his involvement, heavily anchoring the transient phantom to a specific, localized crime scene that he thought he had perfectly abandoned thousands of miles behind him. The discovery of the photograph transformed a localized kidnapping arrest into a sprawling, nationwide serial killer investigation, proving that the very media he obsessively created to document his absolute power had ultimately provided the exact map required to completely dismantle his lethal enterprise. Armed with the overwhelming, irrefutable photographic evidence recovered directly from his truck, prosecutors successfully charged Robert Benrods with the first-degree murder of Regina Walters, entirely dismantling any potential legal defense he could possibly attempt to mount. He ultimately pleaded guilty to her murder in 1992, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in the state of Illinois, permanently removing the highly dangerous predator from the interstate highway system he had terrorized for years. Years later, he was eventually extradited to Texas and convicted of the murders of Ricky Lee Jones and another victim, adding additional life sentences to his permanent record and ensuring he will quietly die securely locked inside a maximum security penitentiary. The tragic, terrifying legacy of Regina Walters is permanently intertwined with that specific, haunting photograph, an image that remains a highly utilized teaching tool for law enforcement profiling and a grim, enduring testament to the absolute vulnerability of runaway children. Rhodes fundamentally believed that his massive mobility and transient lifestyle provided him with the perfect, impenetrable shield against detection, utterly failing to realize that his pathological need to physically archive his atrocities with a camera would completely engineer his own spectacular downfall. By retaining the highly incriminating Polaroid of his captive, he provided investigators with the exact visual confession they required to solve a crime that spanned multiple jurisdictions, completely proving that a predator's extreme vanity is frequently their most fatal flaw. While Rhodes relied on instant film to document a highly isolated, rural murder far away from his own permanent residence, other prolific serial killers utilized similar instant photography to heavily document themselves actively operating directly within the intimate, domestic spaces of their victims. This deeply disturbing, highly organized need to photograph oneself within the crime scene introduces a terrifying evolution in predatory documentation, shifting the focus from a mobile truck cab to the seemingly secure, locked bedrooms of unsuspecting suburban neighborhoods. We must now turn our attention from the desolate highways of the American Midwest to the quiet, terrified streets of Wichita, Kansas, where a highly organized, deeply meticulous phantom terrorized a tight-knit community for over 3 decades. We will examine how this infamous strangler's obsessive habit of taking chilling self-portraits, combined with a sudden, arrogant shift into modern digital media, ultimately shattered his 30-year evasion and provided the exact, indisputable digital footprint required to permanently end his reign. In the sprawling, heavily populated heartland city of Wichita, Kansas, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the concept of a completely invisible, highly organized serial predator was an absolute nightmare that permanently altered the psychological landscape of the entire community. Dennis Rader completely weaponized the absolute banality of his everyday existence, perfectly disguising himself as a deeply devoted husband, a highly respected Boy Scout leader, the active president of his local church congregation, and an incredibly strict municipal compliance officer. This flawless, heavily reinforced public facade of aggressive mediocrity provided him with the ultimate, impenetrable camouflage, allowing him to seamlessly blend into the very suburban neighborhoods he was actively targeting without ever drawing a single shred of suspicion from his neighbors or law enforcement. Utilizing his legitimate employment as an ADT security system installer, Rader gained unprecedented, highly detailed knowledge of how to effortlessly bypass residential alarms, transforming the very mechanisms designed to keep families safe into tools for his own absolute domination. He spent countless hours meticulously stalking his community, heavily documenting the daily routines, vulnerabilities, and precise schedules of entirely unsuspecting women and families, treating his localized hunting ground with the strict discipline of a military operation. The deeply terrifying reality of this specific predator was that he did not hide in the dark alleys or transient highways, but rather walked confidently through the front doors of his community, heavily protected by an aura of complete, undeniable normalcy. The citizens of Wichita were entirely unaware that the incredibly mundane city inspector writing their Grass Heights citations, was actively harboring an insatiable, highly structured bloodlust that would soon fundamentally redefine the methodology of American true crime. He viewed himself as an apex intellectual predator, completely convinced that his meticulous planning and deeply disciplined execution made him inherently superior to the heavily funded police departments that would eventually spend decades desperately trying to uncover his true identity. This deeply ingrained, massive superiority complex allowed him to operate with a terrifying level of patience, carefully selecting his targets over long periods of time before executing heavily planned invasions that were designed to maximize absolute psychological and physical terror. The fragile, heavily guarded innocence of this Midwestern community was completely unprepared for the sudden, catastrophic violence that Rader was meticulously preparing to unleash from behind the secure, heavily locked doors of his seemingly perfect suburban life. The absolute shattering of Wichita's peaceful normalcy occurred on January 15, 1974, with the brutal, highly methodical annihilation of 4 members of the Otero family inside the absolute safety of their own home. Rader successfully cut the exterior phone lines, effortlessly bypassed the residential locks, and systematically bound, heavily tortured, and ultimately strangled the parents and 2 of their young children, officially launching a massive, localized reign of terror. Instead of completely retreating into the shadows following this horrific massacre, Rader actively sought the immediate, terrifying spotlight, leaving a highly detailed, chilling letter securely hidden inside a public library engineering book that explicitly claimed responsibility for the atrocities. Within this initial communication, he formally introduced himself to the authorities and the terrified public using the self-appointed moniker BTK, a deeply disturbing acronym specifically chosen to represent his rigid, 3-step methodology: bind, torture, kill. This heavily calculated, incredibly arrogant communication marked the definitive point of no return for the investigation, establishing a highly twisted, permanently parasitic relationship between the elusive killer, the frantic local media, and the completely paralyzed citizenry. He was fundamentally unsatisfied with merely committing the physical act of murder in private. His massive, unchecked narcissism required the entire city to constantly acknowledge his absolute power, demanding a massive, captive audience for his continuing atrocities. His subsequent, heavily planned murders of entirely innocent young women like Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, and Nancy Fox were strictly characterized by this exact same meticulous methodology, where the complete invasion and absolute violation of their safest personal spaces was paramount to his gratification. He aggressively transformed ordinary, heavily locked suburban bedrooms into terrifying, inescapable stages for his absolute dominance, completely proving that standard security measures were utterly useless against a deeply dedicated predator who had specifically trained to defeat them. Following each brutal strangulation, Rader would meticulously clean the crime scenes and heavily gather specific, personal trophies from the deceased victims, explicitly intending to permanently archive the horrific experiences within his own deeply guarded, private collection. The sheer, undeniable audacity of a killer who could effortlessly enter locked homes, execute multiple individuals, and then actively taunt the heavily armed police department through the mail created an unprecedented atmosphere of absolute dread across the entire state of Kansas. For 3 agonizing, heavily frustrating decades, the BTK Strangler completely eluded one of the largest, most heavily funded investigative manhunts in the entire history of American law enforcement, eventually slipping into a prolonged, heavily debated period of dormancy during the 1990s. While the localized police departments continually chased thousands of dead end leads and actively investigated entirely false suspects, Rader quietly satisfied his horrific urges by constantly revisiting his highly organized, deeply private archive of visual trophies, securely hidden within his marital home. His most deeply disturbing, heavily organized compulsion was his absolute need to physically document his own presence within the immediate aftermath of his crimes, frequently utilizing a standard Polaroid camera to capture chilling, highly staged self-portraits. In these deeply private photographs, Rader would physically wear the stolen underwear, specific clothing, and personal jewelry of his deceased victims, meticulously binding himself in heavy, complex ropes to exactly recreate the precise physical trauma he had previously inflicted on others. He utilized this instant film technology to permanently preserve his absolute, God-like control over the heavily violated individuals, ensuring he could endlessly relive the peak moments of his atrocities long after the active investigations had seemingly gone completely cold. However, in early 2004, deeply insulted by a massive local newspaper retrospective that explicitly suggested the BTK killer was either dead, completely incarcerated for an unrelated crime, or entirely forgotten by the modern public, Rader's massive vanity aggressively flared back to life. He immediately prompted a heavily orchestrated, incredibly terrifying resurgence, actively dropping heavily packaged clues, terrifying new letters, and previously stolen driver's licenses into public municipal drop boxes situated directly around the terrified city. This sudden, highly publicized reinitiation of contact instantly paralyzed the city of Wichita with a massive, renewed wave of absolute terror, forcefully reopening the darkest chapter in the region's history, just as the community believed the phantom was permanently gone. Despite the massive psychological toll this return took on the public, the highly arrogant resurgence simultaneously provided a new generation of seasoned detectives with completely fresh, highly tangible opportunities to aggressively analyze his communications. The authorities rapidly deployed highly advanced, modern forensic technologies that simply had not existed during his original killing spree, heavily preparing to capitalize on any possible mistake the aging, overly confident predator might make in his desperate bid to reclaim his terrifying legacy. The absolute climax of this sprawling 30-year criminal investigation occurred in early 2005, entirely triggered by an incredibly arrogant, deeply catastrophic technological miscalculation made by a killer who falsely believed his superior intellect could easily outsmart modern digital forensics. Desperate to discover a much more efficient, highly modernized method to communicate his massive threats, without leaving a physical, easily traceable paper trail, Rader brazenly placed a heavily coded, classified advertisement attempting to directly ask the police a technical question. He explicitly demanded to know if a standard, commercially available floppy disk could be completely traced back to a specific computer or user if he utilized it to securely deliver his next, heavily formatted manifesto to the local media. The Wichita Police Department, brilliantly recognizing a massive, highly unprecedented tactical opportunity to completely deceive the arrogant predator, publicly responded through a carefully worded newspaper advertisement, falsely assuring the serial killer that the digital discs were entirely secure and absolutely untraceable. Completely trusting this heavily manipulated, highly strategic public response, Rader brazenly sent a purple, 1.44 megabyte floppy disk heavily loaded with his documents directly to a localized television station, entirely completely unaware that he had just surrendered his absolute anonymity. When highly trained digital forensic analysts eagerly examined the completely intact disk, they rapidly recovered heavily deleted metadata, deeply hidden within the formatting code of a seemingly empty Microsoft Word document that the killer had failed to properly scrub. This completely undeniable digital footprint explicitly revealed that the exact file had been recently modified by a specific user named Dennis on a localized computer system actively registered to the Christ Lutheran Church in the immediate Wichita area. The sheer, massive shock of this immediate digital breakthrough directly pointed heavily armed investigators straight toward the church's actively serving congregation president, Dennis Rader, completely destroying the impenetrable disguise he had flawlessly maintained for over 30 years. Acting with absolute precision, detectives secretly obtained a heavily guarded DNA sample from his daughter's localized medical records, securing an absolute, irrefutable forensic match to the preserved biological evidence carefully collected from the massive 1970s crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, heavily armed, highly coordinated tactical units abruptly swarmed Rader's municipal vehicle during a completely routine drive in his neighborhood, immediately arresting the stunned compliance officer and permanently neutralizing the phantom without firing a single shot. Following his completely shocking, highly publicized daytime arrest, the entire massive community of Wichita was completely devastated and deeply traumatized to definitively discover that the elusive, terrifying BTK strangler was actually a painfully ordinary, heavily involved local community leader. The absolute realization that the monster who had heavily terrorized their specific neighborhoods for a generation was seamlessly blended into their church pews, municipal offices, and scout meetings completely shattered the region's fundamental sense of collective security and trust. Confronted with the massive, completely undeniable avalanche of absolute DNA evidence and the catastrophic digital metadata, he had incredibly foolishly handed directly to the police department. Rader entirely abandoned his mundane facade and readily pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. During his highly publicized, heavily guarded sentencing hearing, the aged killer stood firmly in the courtroom and calmly, clinically described the exact, highly horrific details of his brutal strangulations without demonstrating a single, solitary shred of human empathy or genuine remorse. He completely treated the detailed recounting of the massive atrocities as if he were delivering a heavily rehearsed, completely mundane corporate presentation, further horrifying the grieving families who were completely forced to listen to his highly clinical dissection of their loved ones' final moments. The presiding district judge subsequently sentenced him to 10 consecutive, highly secure life terms, permanently ensuring that the heavily organized predator would absolutely never see the outside of a maximum security solitary confinement cell at the heavily fortified El Dorado Correctional Facility. His massive, highly organized cache of deeply disturbing Polaroid self-portraits, extremely detailed journals, and completely stolen physical trophies were heavily confiscated by the authorities, permanently stripping the killer of the absolute visual dominion he had obsessively utilized to fuel his madness. The completely devastating legacy of Dennis Rader serves as a massive, permanent historical reminder that extreme, unchecked arrogance frequently overrides basic predatory caution, completely proving that a desperate need for public recognition can entirely destroy a lifetime of meticulous planning. His total, absolute downfall was entirely orchestrated not by a massive forensic oversight at a physical crime scene, but by a highly microscopic string of digital metadata on a single floppy disk, representing the absolute ultimate victory of modern technology over an aging phantom. While Rader heavily utilized instant photography to strictly document himself within the heavily violated spaces of his localized victims, our final narrative completely shifts the focus to a highly organized predator who utilized the exact same physical medium to heavily catalog the agonizing, prolonged deterioration of captives held deep within his own heavily fortified residence. We must now completely turn our attention to the sprawling, historic neighborhoods of Kansas City, where a seemingly harmless neighborhood merchant accidentally allowed a single, heavily traumatized victim to violently escape, instantly exposing a massive, heavily documented archive of absolute clinical butchery. During the 1980s, the bustling Westport Entertainment District of Kansas City, Missouri was heavily defined by its eclectic mix of independent businesses, vibrant nightlife, and a close, knit community of local merchants who looked out for one another. At the very center of this lively neighborhood stood a highly prominent, eccentric local figure named Bob Berdella, a man who owned a popular novelty shop cleverly named Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, which specialized in selling unusual oddities, human skulls, and occult paraphernalia. Berdella was widely considered a highly intelligent, intensely helpful, and thoroughly integrated member of society, actively serving as a leading voice in the Neighborhood Watch program, and frequently cooperating with local law enforcement to report petty thefts in his commercial district. He presented an incredibly flawless public facade of a quirky, but ultimately harmless small business owner, heavily masking a deeply psychopathic, clinically sadistic nature that he meticulously satisfied within the heavily reinforced walls of his private residence on Charlotte Street. Unlike predators who utilized the transient anonymity of highways or the isolated depths of remote mountain ranges, Berdella completely weaponized the inherent trust of his urban environment, actively seeking out highly vulnerable, marginalized young men who were struggling with homelessness, addiction, or profound social isolation. He utilized his seemingly generous, paternal persona to effortlessly lure these desperate individuals back to his quiet residential home under the entirely false pretenses of offering them temporary shelter, steady handyman work, or financial assistance. Once his unsuspecting victims stepped through his front door, the heavy locks immediately secured behind them, instantly transforming the comfortable, seemingly normal suburban house into an inescapable, highly organized laboratory of prolonged human suffering. The stark, deeply terrifying contrast between his highly public, heavily trusted role as a neighborhood guardian and his completely hidden, active reality as an apex predator allowed him to operate with absolute impunity for 4 agonizing years. His neighbors, who frequently saw him working in his yard or loudly advocating for community safety, were completely unaware that the very man protecting their streets was actively engineering one of the most horrific, heavily documented killing sprees in Midwestern history. The absolute terror of the Kansas City butcher lay not in a terrifying, monstrous appearance, but in the chilling reality that pure, unadulterated evil can easily reside in the friendly merchant who lives right down the street. The catastrophic unraveling of Berdella's heavily organized, highly localized reign of terror occurred suddenly in early April of 1988, completely triggered by a single, desperate moment of sheer survival instinct from a 22-year-old victim named Christopher Bryson. Bryson, completely fitting Berdella's highly specific victimology, had been successfully lured to the Charlotte Street residence under the guise of an entirely innocent social visit, only to be heavily drugged, violently bound, and dragged to the second floor of the house. For nearly a week, Bryson endured an unimaginable, deeply horrific cycle of extreme physical and psychological torture, during which Berdella routinely utilized heavy sedatives and animal tranquilizers to maintain absolute, paralyzing control over his captive. Throughout this prolonged ordeal, Berdella completely dropped his friendly merchant facade, revealing a cold, clinical sadist who meticulously utilized severe electrical shocks, heavy physical beatings, and excruciating restraints to systematically break the young man's will to live. However, on the 4th morning of his captivity, a highly rare, profoundly arrogant lapse in judgment from the overly confident predator completely altered the trajectory of the entire situation when Berdella temporarily left the house to tend to his Westport business. Realizing that his captor had finally exited the premises, Bryson harnessed an incredible, desperate surge of adrenaline, violently fighting through the heavy haze of tranquilizers and physical trauma to completely break free from his heavy restraints. Wearing absolutely nothing but a heavy metal dog collar that Berdella had sadistically secured around his neck, the severely injured young man forcefully threw himself from a second-story window, plummeting to the ground below in a frantic, absolute bid for his life. He sprinted toward a neighbor's house in broad daylight, screaming for immediate police assistance and completely shattering the profound, deadly silence that had permanently masked the horrors occurring inside the Charlotte Street residence. This highly public, completely undeniable escape marked the absolute point of no return for Berdella's heavily concealed operation, instantly transforming a quiet urban street into an active, massively highly prioritized crime scene. By successfully breaking free from the heavily fortified torture chamber, Bryson unwittingly initiated the total collapse of a massive serial killing enterprise, forcing law enforcement to immediately confront the unimaginable depravity heavily hidden next door. When officers from the Kansas City Police Department rapidly descended upon the quiet Charlotte Street residence to execute a highly urgent search warrant, they initially encountered a massive, disorganized horde of antique furniture, peculiar oddities, and overwhelming clutter that completely filled the home. However, as highly trained crime scene investigators meticulously dug deeper into the physical chaos, the seemingly normal facade of a local eccentric immediately dissolved, revealing a deeply terrifying, highly organized epicenter of clinical butchery. Detectives were absolutely horrified to uncover a heavy cache of physical evidence that completely corroborated Bryson's harrowing claims, including heavy electrical torture devices, massive quantities of animal tranquilizers, and blood-soaked bedding completely hidden amidst the mundane household items. The most devastating, completely irrefutable breakthrough in the entire investigation, however, occurred when investigators located two heavily secured envelopes, entirely stuffed with hundreds of incredibly clear, highly detailed Polaroid photographs that Berdella had obsessively taken of his captive victims. Alongside this massive visual archive, detectives discovered incredibly meticulous, heavily detailed handwritten spiral notebooks that served as highly clinical torture logs, rigorously documenting the exact dosages of injected chemicals, the specific physical methods utilized, and the agonizing physiological responses of every single victim. These chilling records explicitly detailed his horrifying, systematic attempts to intentionally blind his victims with harsh chemicals, carefully documenting the exact progression of their deterioration, as if he were conducting a heavily sanctioned, deeply legitimate medical experiment. The sheer, massive volume of this highly organized self-documentation instantly forced investigators to realize they were not merely dealing with a singular, horrific kidnapping case, but rather uncovering the heavily preserved remains of an active, highly prolific serial killer. Berdella had systematically captured his own atrocities in real time, utilizing his camera and his pen to heavily immortalize his absolute power over the vulnerable men he lured into his home, creating a permanent, deeply damning archive of his madness. The discovery of these explicit logs and photographs completely bypassed the immediate need for a standard missing persons investigation, providing the authorities with an exact, heavily recorded timeline of multiple murders that had gone completely unnoticed by the community. The massive investigation rapidly escalated from securing a local crime scene to meticulously identifying the numerous young men permanently trapped within the terrifying frames of the recovered instant film. Armed with this overwhelming, entirely undeniable avalanche of physical and visual evidence, heavily armed detectives immediately intercepted Berdella at his Westport shop, completely stripping him of his friendly merchant persona and placing him heavily under arrest. When the highly confident predator was initially brought into the interrogation room, he aggressively attempted to maintain his standard, highly intelligent facade, completely relying on his established community standing to heavily deflect the severe accusations leveled against him. However, his arrogant defenses were instantly and permanently shattered the exact moment seasoned detectives silently spread his own meticulously captured Polaroid photographs and highly detailed handwritten logs across the metal table in front of him. Confronted with the absolute, irrefutable reality of his own deeply treasured physical archives, Berdella completely collapsed, realizing that his pathological, heavily organized need to document his clinical torture had entirely engineered his own spectacular, highly localized downfall. The absolute climax of the entire investigation occurred as detectives used his own precise handwriting to systematically confirm the brutal murders of Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson, men whose disappearances were finally completely solved. The sheer, undeniable scale of the butchery, heavily detailed in his own clinical terminology, completely overwhelmed any possible legal defense he could ever attempt to mount, forcefully cornering him with the very media he had obsessively created to immortalize his control. He was fundamentally forced to acknowledge that his extreme vanity and deeply sick desire for a permanent, physical record of his dominance had entirely bypassed all of his meticulous, highly calculated efforts to physically conceal the bodies. The heavily guarded interrogation room became the exact location where the seemingly harmless neighborhood watchman was permanently unmasked as one of the most prolific, heavily documented monsters in American history. The visual evidence completely ensured that he could never deny his direct, highly active involvement in the prolonged suffering of these men, completely sealing his fate within the justice system before a trial even began. His total downfall served as the ultimate proof that an apex predator's absolute obsession with preserving their crimes on film is frequently the exact mechanism that delivers them directly to justice. Facing a completely insurmountable mountain of deeply incriminating photographic evidence and his own highly detailed written confessions, Bob Berdella engaged in a massive legal maneuver, formally pleading guilty to first, degree murder to specifically avoid the highly probable imposition of the death penalty. In late 1988, the presiding judge officially sentenced the Kansas City butcher to life in prison without the absolute possibility of parole, permanently removing the highly deceptive, completely ruthless predator from the community he had so profoundly betrayed. His time in maximum security incarceration was ultimately short-lived, as Berdella died of a sudden heart attack in his cell in October of 1992, permanently taking his darkest secrets to the grave but leaving behind a massive, heavily documented legacy of absolute horror. Following his death, his highly infamous residence on Charlotte Street was eventually purchased and entirely demolished by the surrounding community, physically erasing the heavily fortified torture chamber from the neighborhood, but failing to completely erase the lasting, deeply ingrained trauma. The devastating loss of the 6 young men left a permanent, highly agonizing void for their grieving families, who were completely forced to confront the absolute reality that their loved ones' final moments were meticulously recorded for a psychopath's entertainment. Berdella's incredibly chilling, heavily preserved polaroids and clinical logs remain highly utilized case studies in the field of forensic psychology, serving as terrifying, absolute testaments to the sheer depths of human depravity capable of hiding behind an ordinary smile. The absolute failure of his meticulously planned, heavily concealed operation completely highlights a fundamental, fatal flaw shared by every single predator examined in these horrific case files and unchecked. Absolutely massive vanity that eventually overrides their own highly trained survival instincts. Each of these 10 killers fundamentally believed their superior intellect or immense physical power granted them the absolute right to not only destroy human life, but to heavily immortalize their atrocities on physical and digital media. This shared, deeply pathological compulsion to eternally preserve their absolute dominance ultimately provided the exact, irrefutable evidence required to completely secure their downfalls, proving that the camera lens is often the most uncompromising witness of all. We must now step back from these terrifying, heavily documented abysses and look at the broader, highly unsettling implications of this grim intersection between extreme violence, unyielding narcissism, and the technology that permanently exposes them. These 10 devastating cases serve as a chilling reminder that extreme vanity often becomes a killer's most fatal vulnerability, proving that the compulsion to immortalize absolute power frequently provides the exact evidence required to secure their destruction. While their horrific visual archives eventually ensured they faced justice, we are left to wonder how many other predators are out there right now, silently documenting their own atrocities in the dark, waiting for a single miscalculation to expose them to the light.